Greetings, my name is Daniel Ray. Thanks for joining me for another video. Welcome to my channel. If you are new here, you know the YouTube deal. Like and subscribe if you want to. That's fine if you don't. If you just want to watch a video, that's cool too. Thanks for stopping by to watch this video about the New Testament. Is it reliable? Join me for an adventure, a very quick adventure. I do not pretend to be exhaustive about this. It's just the tip of the iceberg. Some people might think I'm quote mining, giving you an overview. So I know a little bit about everything, but I'm not an expert in anything necessarily. It's called The Story of the Cosmos. Check it out in the description below. You're like, Dan, stop talking about that book. Is the New Testament reliable? Yes. The first 4 books talk about the birth, life, the teachings, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then you have the history and acts of the apostles in the chapter called Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, believed to have been written by Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And then we have letters, 13 of which are from the Apostle Paul. There's debate about which ones Paul wrote. I think that some of them are Paul's letters, but he probably had a scribe writing for him, so somebody that knew Greek, but they were Paul's words, but maybe a scribe wrote them for some of them. 27 books, 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, the epistolatory letters, and then the book of Revelation. That is the New Testament. So the question on the table is the New Testament, are the texts of the New Testament reliable? Yes.
First of all, the handwritten copies of the New Testament contain a lot of differences. We really are not sure what the number is, but I agree with Bart that there are certainly more differences in the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Secondly, the overwhelming majority of these differences affects virtually nothing.
The late New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce, in his book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable?, says this, quote, "The historicity of Christ is as axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar," end quote. And that's found on page 123. Right off the bat, I'm establishing that Jesus existed. The earliest propagators of Christianity welcomed the fullest examination of the credentials of their message, end quote. And so the early church really was wide open. Take a look. Come and see what happened. Where are you staying, Lord? Come and see. Hey, we found the Messiah. Really? Come and see. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Come and see. Paul says this to King Agrippa. He says, quote, "For the king knows about these matters," speaking of the resurrection, "and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice." You know what's going on here, King. You've heard this. I'm not speaking crazy stuff. Paul tells Agrippa, "For this has not been done in a corner." Dr. Keener says, quote, "Luke informs his audience that he was thoroughly familiar with the matters about which he writes. It does indicate thorough acquaintance by one means or another." There's a verb, Greek word there that I can't even pronounce. That means a thorough acquaintance with the subject matter that Luke is talking about. And indeed, this is what Luke is saying in the opening of his gospel to Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus. Hey, I know about this, and I'm writing what I know about. Here you go. Here's some history. And so the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke is really good history, according to Dr. Keener.
The standard introduction to New Testament textual criticism puts things in perspective. It would be a mistake to think that the uncontrolled copying practices that led to the formation of the Western textual tradition were followed everywhere that texts were reproduced in the Roman Empire. In particular, there's solid evidence that in at least one major see of early Christendom, the city of Alexandria, there was conscious and conscientious control exercised in the copying of the books of the New Testament. Textual witnesses connected to Alexandria attest a high quality of textual transmission from the earliest times. It was there that a very ancient line of text was copied and preserved. These words are found in the 4th edition of the Text of the New Testament by Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman.
Scholars often note that Acts provides some of the most complete evidence available for first century Eastern Mediterranean life from a non-aristocratic perspective. Dr. Keener goes on to say that Luke, quote, is not writing about mythical characters, but about Peter and Paul and Agrippa I and Gallio and Felix and Festus and Agrippa II and many others. Granted, we cannot reconstruct historical details with certainty, but many literary interpretations of the works likewise remain debated. So Dr. Keener says this about the incomplete historical record, quote, that a task cannot be completed perfectly is not necessarily reason to abandon it. Otherwise, we would have to abandon inquiry about ancient history altogether, end quote.
Are the skeptics really going to say that they have no idea what Plato or Demosthenes or Suetonius wrote? If they apply their skepticism of the New Testament text to the rest of Greco-Roman literature, then we might as well kiss all our ancient history books goodbye.
For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And that's from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 6. This is the earliest reference to the resurrection that we have in the New Testament.
Is what we have now what the New Testament authors wrote nearly 2,000 years ago? It almost certainly is in all essentials. Even in most particulars, we can be relatively sure. To be uber skeptical about this in the face of the mountain of evidence is to take a leap of faith where the guardrail should have been.
So when we're talking about New Testament documents, what we're talking about are documents that are independent and early, and that's historical gold when you come to the idea of written manuscripts. In other words, so the action that the Bible describes, what the Bible describes, when it was written and when it actually happened, there's obviously going to be a gap. It happened over here, it was written here. And so with the Bible, with the New Testament, we have a wonderful small gap between the events that are written and when they were actually written, and then the manuscripts themselves. And so there's only a few decades between the events and when they were believed to have been written down. This potentially was written just a little more than 20 years after the resurrection. So here's the events that Paul's writing about, only 20 years after they happened. Now, some critics say, well, 20 years, Ray, that's a lot of time. A lot of people, this oral tradition stuff. In terms of historical manuscripts, that is gold. There's nothing else in ancient history that we have like that. Any ancient manuscript or document we have from ancient Rome or Greece, the extant manuscripts, the events they record and when they were written.
Skeptics repeatedly note that the vast majority of New Testament manuscripts come from at least 800 years after the completion of the New Testament. The implication they draw from this is that none of these manuscripts are trustworthy, that the New Testament is in no better shape than any other ancient literature. What they don't tell you is that these later manuscripts add only 2% material to the text. If you can envision the New Testament as a snowball rolling down a hill, picking up alien elements through the centuries, it's remarkable that it only picks up 2% more material over 14 centuries. And they don't tell you how this compares to other ancient writers. For many important authors, we only have partial works. Livy and Tacitus were two of the most important Roman historians of the first century CE. We base an awful lot of our understanding of Rome on these two writers. Livy wrote 142 volumes on the history of Rome. Only 25% of them survive today. Only a third of Tacitus' writings are still with us. But we have 200 copies of Pliny the Elder's writings, but we're waiting 700 years for the first one. Plutarch's lives are found in manuscripts no earlier than 800 years after he wrote. Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews is found in more than 20 copies, none earlier than the 9th century.
For if the dead are not raised, Not even Christ has been raised, for if the dead are not raised, your faith is worthless, you are still in your sins. And so Christianity spread from in and around Jerusalem out into the Mediterranean world and off into the rest of the world eventually. But if it all really, Paul puts the emphasis on Jesus' resurrection. If that didn't happen, Christianity is worthless. It's meaningless, and we're all to be among men most pitied if we believe something that was just made up. And so the resurrection of Jesus could be, you could find out, come and see, did this really happen? Well, come and see, come and talk to the people who saw Jesus alive after his crucifixion. If Jesus wrote no book, what he said was treasured and repeated by those who heard him and by their hearers in turn. To those who confessed him as Lord, his words were at least as authoritative as those of Moses and the prophets. They were transmitted as a most important element in the tradition of early Christianity, together with the record of his works, his death and resurrection. These were delivered by the original witnesses and received in turn by others, not simply as an outline of historical events, but as the church's confession of faith and as the message which it was commissioned to spread abroad. Now, Dr. Bruce is explaining exactly what the Apostle Paul was explaining in 1 Corinthians 15, that he received a tradition from the apostles in Jerusalem and then carried that forth in his mission to the Gentiles, and it spread abroad. All Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. For the Word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, even penetrating as far as the division of soul and spirit, of both joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart.
If you wanted a copy of the gospel and you lived in Ephesus, but it was made in Rome, you had to make a copy in Rome and take it to Ephesus. And then you made a copy that was maybe a copy of the copy of the copy. So maybe you're making a copy of a copy that in fact had a lot of mistakes in it, but that's the copy you have now in Ephesus. And suppose somebody from Colossae wants a copy. So they come to Ephesus and they make a copy of this mistaken copy, and that's the gospel they have in Colossae. And then suppose somebody from Antioch wants a copy. Well, they come to Colossae and they make a copy there of this errant copy that's based on copies of the copies of the copies, and it circulates around the Roman world like this, with everybody making mistakes and no way for us to know what mistakes had been made at the early stages.
How do you account for the errors of the scribes when the New Testament was handed down person to person?
Yeah, excellent question. There are errors that we know about. Why? Because we can compare the documents, we can compare the manuscripts and see where the errors are. In fact, let me see if I can show you a representation of that, because it's better seen than it is described. Here it is. Let's say you have, here's the original, which we don't have. We don't, at least we don't think we have any original documents, okay? So they're all copies, okay? And let's say you find 4 different copies. And in the first copy, you see an error right here. And then another copy, there's another error right there. In the third copy, there's another error right there. And in the fourth copy, there's an error right there. Can you reconstruct the original?
Yes.
Yes. And that's what scholars do. The original, this happens to be Romans 3:26, God is just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Now the note here is the New Testament documents have far fewer variations than this example. So yes, sometimes scribe made mistakes, but in virtually all cases, we know what the mistake was, and we can correct it by comparing it with other documents.
As a result of the copying practices, there are lots of mistakes found in our surviving copies. Now we have 5,600 manuscripts. How many differences do we know about today? The reality is, nobody knows. Nobody has been able to count all the differences in our manuscripts. Some scholars say there are 200,000 differences. Some say there are 300,000 differences. Some say there are 400,000 differences. We don't know. Even with the advances of computer technology, we don't know. One thing we can say for certain is that there are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. There are a lot of differences in the manuscripts. And those are just the manuscripts we have. How many differences were there earlier? We don't know. Now, what kind of mistakes do we have in these manuscripts? So, just to be quite clear about this, most of these 300,000, 400,000 differences are completely immaterial, insignificant, and don't matter for a thing other than to show that scribes in the ancient world could spell no better than my students can today.
When you hear him say there are more differences in the New Testament manuscript than there are words in the New Testament, you're like, whoa, and so you kind of get this idea, well, if there are so many differences, can we really trust it? And so I think an analogy is helpful here to explain kind of how I process this. It's kind of like if you imagine Dr. Airman as an airline pilot. He's flying along. Maybe they're going to Houston or something, and he says,
ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Just been informed there are several thousand small screws missing from the aircraft. Shouldn't impact the rest of our flight. But we are going to land in Houston just a little earlier tonight in case. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of your flight.
I'd be really nervous. I'd be looking to see if I could see missing screws on the wing if I had a window seat. But that's a little unnerving, isn't it? But I think that's kind of the impact that he might have on Christians who are hearing this information for the first time. And it seems like, okay, and then you find out he's an agnostic or a skeptic, and you're like, man, are the New Testament texts really trustworthy? So I think this is a little seed that he plants. He says it's no big deal. He clarifies that. He's very open about that. He says, yes, these don't matter. But when you hear this for the first time, I think it lodges in people's minds that, well, maybe we can't trust it,
Not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. You could probably put that to a tune. I like it. Well, first of all, this is probably true, but we really can't be certain about it. We can't be dogmatic if that's the case. But let's assume that it's true, but if it is, it's not the whole truth. The impression one gets from the statement is that the transmission of the New Testament is like the telephone game. It's a game that every child knows. You whisper something into somebody's ear, it goes down through 10 or 12 people, and then that last person spits it out to the whole crowd, and everybody laughs because the message got totally garbled. There's absolutely no motivation to get it right. But copying of New Testament manuscripts is hardly like this parlor game. First of all, the message is passed on in writing, not just orally. Secondly, textual critics do not rely on just the last person, but can examine the work of several scribes who are closer to the original source.
Mark D. Roberts says this in his book, Can We Trust the Gospels? Quote, having many manuscripts actually increases the likelihood of our getting back to the original text. It also adds the number of variants, however, which can sound negative to one who isn't familiar with text critical issues, page 33. Here's an example of how I think Dr. Airman affirms the reliability of the New Testament text. This is just one example from his book, Did Jesus Exist? And he says this on page 328, quote, there are solid reasons for thinking that Jesus really was betrayed by one of his followers, Judas Iscariot. It is, of course, recorded in multiple independent traditions, Mark, M, John, the book of Acts, thus Mark 14:10 through 11, 43 why can't I say 43 through 50? Matthew 27:3 through 10, John 18:1 through 11, Acts 1:15 through 20. So here he's saying we have good, solid reason to believe that Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus. Why? Because of the independent sources. What are those? Matthew? John? Mark? And so he's making a deduction from reliable texts. We can say Jesus existed, and we can say that Judas Iscariot betrayed him. And so this, again, this is just an example of how I think Bart Ehrman actually shows that the New Testament texts are actually reliable when he makes conclusions like these about the text. Now, Dr. Turek and the late Dr. Geisler outline in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, 10 reasons why they think the New Testament text is reliable. We'll just briefly touch on them here, and you can check out this book if you haven't already, but these are some good ideas that give you a good solid handle on and reasons to believe why the New Testament is reliable. One, it has embarrassing details about the disciples. It has difficult sayings of Jesus and demanding sayings of Jesus, you know, cut off your hand, pluck out your eye, sell all your stuff. You know, that's left in there. It's not easy. Jesus' own words are distinct from the words of the writers. And who would invent the resurrection as having happened in and around a very Jewish metropolis, if you will, of the ancient world, Jerusalem, ruled by Rome? You're just going to make up a story about the resurrection happening right there in the middle of Jerusalem? That seems highly unlikely that you would invent and concoct such a story that could be verified to be false by a multitude of different people. So number 6, there are more than 30 historical persons mentioned in the text of the New Testament. There are divergent details, of course, different perspectives, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Invitations to examine the evidence, as we pointed out earlier. Unembellished miracle accounts. The miracle accounts are just sort of like newspaper stories. They're not this flowery, eloquent, make it look bigger than it is sort of thing. They are basically what they call unadorned or unembellished factual narratives about Jesus doing miracles. The miracle at the wedding of Cana in John chapter 2, turning water into wine, for example, or Jesus walking on the water, or calming the storm, or feeding the 5,000. They're just sort of matter of fact right in there. It's like, whoa, you know, they're unembellished. And then you have people's complete change of life, like the Apostle Paul. Holding fast to their testimony in the face of suffering and persecution and death. And so those are the 10 reasons that Geisler and Turek give for why they believe that the New Testament is indeed reliable and trustworthy and historically true. And so for the scorpions and serpents in Mark 16, 9 through 20, and the woman caught in adultery in John 7 and 8 there, many scholars believe these were later additions and only appear in later manuscripts, not the earliest manuscripts. And so since these don't appear in the earliest manuscripts, and then what scholars conclude is that they probably were not in the originals. But these additions do not in any way impact major basic fundamental Christian doctrine. The other one he mentions is the Comma Johannin, the small phrase insertion in 1 John 5 that seems to be pointing to the Trinity. Scholars likewise believe that is a later addition that appears 14th, 15th century in many Latin manuscripts, but it does not appear in the earliest manuscripts. There are many other passages throughout the New Testament where you can infer the doctrine of the Trinity, but that Trinitarian insertion in 1 John 5 is a later insertion that appears in the 1400s or 15th century. Mark D. Roberts says this: in virtually every case, Ehrman confidently explains what the change was, what the earlier manuscripts actually said, and what motivated the copyist. Misquoting Jesus, Ehrman's book, though intending to weaken our certainty about the New Testament text, actually demonstrates how the abundance of manuscripts and the antiquity of manuscripts, when run through the mill of text-critical methodology, allow us to know with a very high level of probability what the evangelists and other New Testament authors wrote.
You're studying Misquoting Jesus?
No, his textbook, the New Testament.
Okay, well, that one that he co-wrote with Metzger is actually good. But this one, now here's what he says. This is in the appendix of the paperback version. So this comes out a year or two later from the original Misquoting Jesus. He's interviewed And in the interview, here's what he says. Check this out. This is a quote from the book, page 252. He says, Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him, and even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. What are they in agreement on? If he and I were put into a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Well, why would you write misquoting Jesus then? Not you, but Bart Ehrman, right? The book maybe should be called Misquoting Ehrman because he doesn't even agree with himself. So it seems that even Ehrman, when push comes to shove, admits that we do have an accurate copy of the New Testament documents. Now, why is he coming to 2 different conclusions the same year? Same evidence. The only thing I can speculate is when you say to the academic community something wrong, they'll correct you on it. But when you say something wrong to the lay community, they don't know any better. In most cases. You can sell a lot of books when you say the New Testament documents aren't copied reliably. That gets you a review in the New York Times, that gets you on the Colbert Show, the Jon Stewart Show. You sell a lot of books.
Now, Dr. Ehrman on his blog actually addresses Frank Turek's question because he's heard it so many times. Well, Bart Ehrman just wants to sell books. Well, he says on the blog, of course I want to sell books, but he's saying that people use that as some kind of sinister attack on his character. And this is from May 2015. Dr. Ehrman says, quote, "A lot of biblical scholars have not wanted people to know because they were afraid it could hurt their faith in the Bible. And in part because most biblical scholars who focus on this area simply were not interested in or able to communicate this kind of information to a popular audience." That's an interesting statement. Now, it's probably true that there are a lot of scholars that don't want to write books about New Testament variants because they don't matter. As we've noticed, even Bart Ehrman says they don't matter, the small variations and scribal variations. Why write a book about something that doesn't matter? That would bore people to death. Oh, look, this manuscript has an A. This manuscript is missing the A. How do you write a book about that? Why would you write a book about that?
Now, I wrote my master's thesis on when the article does not occur in the Greek New Testament. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on when the definite article does occur in the Greek New Testament. These 2 works could cure the most hopeless insomniac.
And so Dr. Ehrman believes that, I'm sure he's right because he travels in the scholarly circles. There are people that aren't interested in writing a book about that. But the other interesting thing he says is that he thinks that many scholars were afraid it could hurt people's faith in the Bible. So why did Dr. Ehrman write this book then? If that really was circulating among the scholarly world in which he travels, Dr. Ehrman, why did you write this book then? Were you trying to make us afraid of lose our faith in the Bible? Is that what your aim was? You just sort of dismiss that? It's like, oh, these people can handle it? I don't know. This is just what Dr. Ehrman is saying. But now the third thing really here is interesting. They weren't able to communicate this? Now that's a really... Now, maybe some people aren't. Maybe some people, scholars, not all scholars write books, I guess. But there is a ton of information out there for Christians about this very topic. New Testament criticism, New Testament history, text criticism, the historicity of Jesus. Can we trust the Gospels? Can we trust the New Testament documents? There are a wide variety of books written for a wider lay audience on these very topics, and that's where I got most of my information. I am not a scholar in this area, but there is a great wealth of knowledge and books out there written by scholars for lay people. You have Craig Evans, Craig Blomberg, F.F. Bruce, you have Gary Habermas, Daniel Wallace, Paul Barnett, Justin Bass, Mark Roberts, Bruce Metzger, Mike Licona. I took a couple of classes from Dr. Licona at Houston Baptist. He goes on to say that a scholar who wants to communicate this information has to figure out how to make it interesting and show why it is important. That is what I tried to do in Misquoting Jesus. Was it so people would buy the book? Of course it was so people would buy the book. Why else would I have written it? This is really important information and people need to know it and have the right to know it. So it's information, it's important information, he said, but it's interesting too if you think about it. All of these New Testament variants, is that he says they have no impact on the doctrines of Scripture. So is it important information or isn't it? I don't know. I want to point out a couple of other things in regards to Dr. Ehrman's belief in science. I say belief or acceptance of certain scientific theory, and contrast it with the way he looks at the New Testament. So he writes in his October 2020 blog that if the overwhelming view among professional scientists is that there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and that the world is made up of particles and forces, and that everything in the world, including life itself, can be explained on the basis of those particles and forces, with nothing else needed, including any external influence of any kind, that should give anyone with religious commitment pause. As he thinks that science has or perhaps can explain away any outside external influences on the universe. So he said, I said if it is the overwhelming view, but in fact it is the scientific view. In other words, he thinks that the scientific view has done away with outside external forces acting on the universe. So then he asked the question, in that light, what is the rationale for believing there is also a God outside of it all? Of course, Ehrman admits he's a materialist. He does not believe in God. What is the rationale for believing there is also a God outside of it all? My non-scholarly YouTube answer is because forces and laws explained by the mathematics as we have in physics and cosmology are descriptions of what we observe, not agents with causal powers. The mathematics and the laws don't cause these things. These are our observations. So I use this example with a speed limit sign. The speed limit sign and even the law itself, 55 miles an hour on this highway, do not ultimately make your car go that fast. The law and the sign that reflects the law have absolutely no power to make your car go fast. If you run out of gas underneath this 55 mile an hour sign, it's not going to help you make your car go 55 miles an hour. It's not going to be the gas in your car. The law is inert. The sign is inert. It has no causal powers or properties. Now, Dr. Ehrman accepts the scientific consensus that the universe had a beginning 13.8 billion years ago. Dr. Turek and Dr. Geisler also accept this. They say that it is also important to understand that the universe did not emerge from existing material, but from nothing. There was no matter before the Big Bang. In fact, chronologically, there was no before the Big Bang because there are no befores without time, and there was no time until the Big Bang. Time, space, and matter came into existence at the Big Bang. That is a predominant theory, the emergent cosmological theory, that time, space, and matter emerges at the singularity, at the Big Bang. And before that, there was no before. There was no time, there was no space, there was no matter, there was no energy, there was no stuff. Now, some people have criticized Dr. Turek and Dr. Geisler because they're not cosmologists, and of course, Bart Ehrman's not a cosmologist, right? And so, maybe it looks like Frank and Norman are speaking out of turn. They're not cosmologists, so they really can't say anything. And they're really way off the mark when it comes to modern cosmology. Well, no, here's something that Dr. Turek and Dr. Ehrman can agree upon. The science says that a lot of scientists, cosmologists say the universe actually had a beginning. Now, let's ask a cosmologist. Is what Frank here is saying, is this accurate? Is this really cosmology? Does this fit into any modern cosmological theories, or is this just apologetic fluff? Dr. Carroll has written 2 books, The Big Picture and Something Deeply Hidden. He's a theoretical cosmologist, not a Christian, but he has a blog for non-specialists like myself called The Preposterous Universe. In 2012, Dr. Carroll was addressing all the brouhaha that was going on with Dr. Lawrence Krauss's book that came out, A Universe from Nothing, where Krauss got a lot of, Krauss was an atheist as well, but he got a lot of criticism for how he philosophically was using the word nothing. And so Dr. Carroll's blog was just chiming in on this controversy. And but in it, he actually affirms what Dr. Turek and Dr. Geisler had said in their book. Dr. Carroll says, this nothing kind of scenario. This kind of scenario is exactly what quantum cosmologists like James Hartle, Stephen Hawking, Alex Vilenkin, Andre Lindy, and others have in mind when they are talking about the creation of the universe from nothing. In this kind of picture, there is literally a moment in the history of the universe prior to which there weren't any other moments, says Dr. Carroll. There is a boundary of time, presumably at the Big Bang, prior to which there was nothing. Not even a quantum wave function. There was no prior thing because there is no sensible notion of prior. This is also interesting and important and worth writing a book about, and it's another one of the possibilities Lawrence Krauss discusses. Dr. Ehrman accepts Big Bang cosmology, and here from the same blog where he was talking about the Big Bang, he believes he has accepted the theory of evolution ever since he was 22. Bart is in his mid to late 60s, I think. So over 40 years, he has accepted the theory of evolution. So in that spirit, I wanted to bring up something that Charles Darwin said about the I that I think fits into what we're talking about here. You know, eyewitness and things like that. Ha, ha, ha. Now, this is a quote that comes from chapter 6 in An Origin of the Species. It talks about how Darwin can understand why people have a problem with the I developing gradually over time. And so here Darwin says, to suppose that the I, with all its imitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. So you see that quoted a lot by Christians who disagree with evolution. I myself have quoted that. But a lot of critics of Christians who use this quote say that Christians take this quote out of context, and the rest of the context in the chapter, Darwin explains, allegedly, how the I came to be. So let's take a look at what else Darwin said about the I. It is scarcely possible to avoid comparing the I with a telescope. So Darwin compares the I with a telescope, and then he goes on to say that, do we have a right to assume the I was built and constructed like a telescope? And he mentions the creator. Should we assume that the creator works by intellectual powers like those of man, if we must compare the eye to an optical instrument? Now, when he says creator here, I know Darwin was not a Christian. I think he fell away. But creator here could just be like a force or something, you know, natural selection maybe. I don't think it's the traditional Judeo-Christian God here. But he's saying let's compare the eye to the telescope. But wait a minute, should we do that? Is that really how the eye came to be? Was it constructed and designed? Or could it have come about gradually? Now, follow this. Darwin says we ought, in imagination. And then he goes on to explain in detail what he's imagining. Take a thick layer of transparent tissue with spaces filled with fluid and with a nerve sensitive to light beneath, and then suppose every part of this layer to be continually changing slowly in density, so as to separate into layers of different densities and thicknesses, placed at different distances from each other, and with the surfaces of each layer slowly changing in form. We must suppose that there is a power represented by natural selection or the survival of the fittest. Notice that he is imagining all of this. There's no evidence for any of this. There's no evidence that this actually happened. It's all in Darwin's imagination. And here we are 150, 160, 170 years later, and there's really been no progress in this field, that we have no further evidence of the biological development of the eye through natural selection over millions of years. Now, why is this discussion coming up in the midst of a discussion about textual criticism? Because Bart Ehrman will say that we don't know what the early scribes were doing. Maybe over the course of decades, some transmission got mangled and people were making stuff up, and so we can't trust this because over the course of decades, when the New Testament was compiled, and then later, as it progressed, Ehrman's suggesting he's used the analogy of telephone before, where you whisper in somebody's ear and then they whisper that in somebody's ear and you pass it along, and by the end of the game, that the person at the end says something like bologna sandwich and the original thing was, Star Wars or something. But telephone is not like the early church. It wasn't done in secret. The gospel wasn't whispered in people's ears. It was proclaimed throughout the whole world. It wasn't done in a corner, as Paul said to Agrippa. What if we tried to explain Christianity as Darwin tried to explain the development of the eye? We'd be run out of Dodge. People would be criticizing us because we said this happened gradually over millions of years. Why not apply his New Testament text-critical standards to the stories of natural selection? Would they hold up? Probably not, because we have no manuscripts.
It is far more reasonable to be relatively sure that we can recover the wording of the original New Testament text than to be radically skeptical about the entire endeavor. Thank you for your attention.